Everybody, in this video, a first look and a setup video on Poseidon's new budget 700C through axle tubeless compatible wheel set. And you're gonna have to forgive me this week. The house is a mess because we've been redoing the floors and my workshop has turned into a storage space. Now, I promise in another week or two, we will be back to the normal studio setup with the cheesy lights and everything. It's all right. Some people say it's not the production value, but the information. So we're gonna put that to the test today. So these are the wheels here. It's an alloy wheel. It's a through axle. The rear is 12 by 142 and the front is your standard 12 by 100 millimeters. And they got 32 spokes front and rear, which is kind of a lot by today's standards, but it definitely makes for a strong wheel. It is a Shimano HG style free hub, which means that if you already have a Poseidon bike, the microshift cassette will swap right onto this, no problem. Now on the non-drive side, you have a 6-bolt disc interface. Now I know it's important to some of you, so I'll get the free hub sound. So not super loud, not silent, just kind of a pretty typical free hub sound. We got silver nipples, which leads me to believe that these are alloy nipples rather than brass nipples. You can see that it's a double-walled rim, which again makes for a really strong wheel. Starting with least important, the outer width is 24 millimeters, and then the depth is about 18.5 millimeters. More importantly, the inner width is 19 millimeters. You could probably get away with like a 48, maybe even a 50 millimeter tire. The wheels don't come with rim tape or tubeless valves installed, so you will need some rim tape. We're going to be using some 21 millimeter Stan's tubeless tape. And then of course you're going to need some tubeless valves. I wouldn't go with anything too much shorter or longer than these 44 millimeter valves. The plan is to also go with a budget gravel tire. These are the Uden gravel-ish kind of tire. These are 700 by 50. So these are probably going to represent the widest tire that you'd ever want to run on this set of wheels. Let's get some weights. The rear wheel comes in at 1212.4 grams. And for the front, 990.3 grams. That's 2202.7 grams for the pair. So definitely not light, but again, this is a budget wheel set designed for the budget-minded gravel enthusiast. Okay, so the first thing you want to do is to tape up the wheels. You want to use a rim tape that's anywhere from 5 millimeters wider than the inner rim width. Before you do anything, you should really clean the taping surface with some isopropyl alcohol. Oof, sheesh, found a little burr on one of the spoke holes here. You definitely want to do your best to kind of file those down. You definitely want those sharp edges minimized. Okay, so this is feeling pretty good. And just grab your rim tape. You're going to tape past the valve hole all the way around and past the valve hole one more time, overlapping by another 3 to 4 inches. So you're trying to do your best to get that tape down into that channel all the way around. Don't be afraid to pull pretty tight. Okay, so the valve hole's right here. My first layer of tape started up here. So I'm going to pass the valve hole and end up right about here. Then I'll just go ahead and cut the tape. Some sharp scissors. And then I'll just push the last little bit down, like so. I generally take a tire lever and I just kind of run it all the way down the bead seat on the rim just to make sure that tape is all the way down and it's not going to peel up. Alright, so we did our best to get that tape right down into that center channel. So the next thing to do is to install the valve. What you want to do is to tighten the Presta valve all the way so that the inner little threaded nub is protruding. Just kind of push it through, like so. You're just going to thread that lock nut down as tight as you can by hand. So next is to install the tires. If you're curious, these come in at 627 grams. So not super light, but also not super heavy considering that this is a really wide tire. No matter what you get, you definitely want a tire that's rated tubeless ready or tubeless compatible. Any rim can essentially be made tubeless as long as you seal up the spoke holes. It's the tire that has to be tubeless specific because for tubeless tires, the bead is less extensible, which means that it can't just stretch and pop off the rim as you're riding. Okay. So rolling direction is this way. Then of course, if you're really particular like some of us, then you'll line up the label with the valve stem. So you just want to work on one bead at a time. You're trying to get that bead down into that center channel. That's what's going to give you enough slack to get that last bit of tire over the rim wall. Okay, so this first bead slipped on real easy. Now as I make my way around to that last little bit, this is where it gets tight as usual. My technique here is to kind of squat down, get the tire kind of wedged between your belly and your legs. And that gives you some nice leverage to be able to push with both palms. A good old grip and roll. And that'll get your tire bead right over that sidewall. And then what I usually do is to remove the valve core entirely. And what that does is that it creates this wide open channel where air can blast in there. So what we're trying to do is to get that compressed air to blast in here, pop both sides of the bead out onto that sort of elevated rim bed at the same time, which creates our seal. So anything we can do to maximize airflow in is a good thing. Now, if you've got a compressor, that's awesome. I don't. What I do have is a booster pump. You can basically pressurize this canister on the side, and then you can blast all that compressed air into the tire at once. Sometimes what I'll even do just to play it safe is I'll just take some plain water and just kind of squirt it right at the interface of the tire bead and the rim. This can sometimes help create that seal just long enough to seat the bead. And it can also reduce friction, which sometimes helps it pop into place a little bit easier as well. Okay, so let's give this a try. Hey, there we go. So you should hear some popping. That's actually a good sign. That's the sound of the bead actually popping in onto the bead seat. Okay, so what to do next is to put the valve core back in. Remember, the bead is sat already on the bead seat, so even if it deflates, the bead should stay on the bead seat. But I generally put the valve core back in one more time just to double check to see if the bead is seated all the way around. So do your best not to lose all the air. On most tires, there's a little line that indicates where the bead starts. And you're just making sure that that line is concentric with the rim. You want to make sure that the gap from that line to the rim is the same all the way around. Yeah, so this bead is pretty much sat perfectly. You just want to make sure to check both sides to make sure it's seated all the way around. We can now add the sealant. Now, pretty much for all my tires, I just use Stan's, which is the sort of de facto sealant in the tubeless tire space. It works really well, it's relatively cheap, and it's widely available. So here we're just going to use our valve core remover. Give the sealant a good shake. The amount of sealant that you put in depends on the size of the tire. These 700 by 50 millimeter tires, we're going to go for 3 ounces per tire. Now if you're going to do it this way, where you first seat the bead dry and then inject the sealant afterwards, you need some way to get the sealant in through this tiny little hole here. And so I use this little KOM sealant injector. It's basically just a syringe with a rigid hose. I'll put a link down in the description, but it's a pretty cheap tool and it works really well. Now, in my opinion, this is the cleanest way to set up tubeless tires, but there are other ways to do this as well. This is where you want to give it a little shake. Sort of let the sealant coat the entire inside of the tire to sort of create that seal. Now, a couple of things that I've noticed right off the bat. It does seem like the spoke tension comes pretty loose from the factory. They're definitely fine to ride as is. You might want to just give your spoke tension a check after, the first couple hundred miles or so. The other thing that I noticed is that burr where the spoke hole was drilled out. If you didn't take care of that, that would have easily cut through the rim tape, or it would have probably punctured an inner tube as well. Now, just a quick comment on the fit and finish. I do notice that the finish is, it's not perfect. I don't know if it was just like a low-cost anodizing job. There are several areas where the sort of raw silver color is showing through under the black finish. It's not really too obvious unless you're looking really close. Now, it'll probably take me a few weeks to get enough miles on these wheels to actually put together a solid review. Now, in the meantime, if you're interested in how switching wheel size affects the handling of your gravel bike, you can check out this video over here. Thanks for watching, and thanks for subscribing to the channel if you haven't already, and I'll see you next time.